If you pay any attention to what's going on in climate change these days, I'm sure you've heard that we need to cut back drastically on our meat consumption in order to save the planet. Welcome to Climate Honesty, where we simplify complex topics to help you be better informed on energy and climate. The story goes something like this. The raising of cattle for beef produces about 50 times as much greenhouse gases for the same amount of protein as we can get from a plant-based source. In addition to that, we use excessive amounts of water in the raising of cattle, and it's a very inefficient way to use agricultural land. We could produce more food, more grams of protein with a plant-based system, raising lentils and beans and things like that, instead of cattle, and we could feed more people with the same amount of agricultural use land. The story says that we produce 20 to 50% of our greenhouse gases from the raising of cattle, and that if we were to stop raising cattle or significantly reduce our cattle production, that this would have a major impact on the climate. Now, this is where the storyline starts to enter into the area of fiction. Back in 2006, the UN issued a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, where they claimed that 18% of greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. After the report was issued, it was shown to have several significant errors and that the number 18% was simply not valid. And it was acknowledged by the authors that, the calculations were incorrect. However, this report gets quoted and these numbers get thrown about as though they're in their actual reality when they are not. In one quote-unquote documentary, the number was listed as high as 51%. Now, this is simply fanciful thinking. It's not even close to reality. The actual number of greenhouse gases that come from all of agriculture is closer to 10%, and livestock accounts for about half of that. So if animal agriculture only accounts for about 4 or 5% of total greenhouse gases, how can the UN make a statement like this? Livestock have a substantial impact on the world's water, land, and biodiversity resources and contribute significantly to climate change. That statement is what drives the UN to try to force people to get away from animal agriculture. So right at the outset, the idea that cattle are a major impact on global greenhouse gas emissions is simply patently false. That's not substantiated by the data. We're talking about a few percent of greenhouse gas emissions. So how does this storyline survive, considering that many people in the scientific community and the agricultural community know it's not true? Well, in today's world, if you keep saying something over and over, people start to believe that it's true. There's a very strong anti-meat movement in the world, in the United Nations, in the World Health Organization, in various other institutions. Just a lot of people who don't like meat. And now that climate change has taken the turn that it has, they're using climate change to basically push the agenda of anti-meat. Now, when we're talking about greenhouse gases in relation to agriculture, we can't just talk about methane, we need to talk about nitrous oxide. And about 3/4 of the nitrous oxide from agriculture comes from synthetic fertilizers. And synthetic fertilizers are used when we don't have adequate amounts of manure or animal byproducts to use as fertilizer. So the storyline against animal agriculture says that animal agriculture produces all this methane, and methane is a more potent gas in terms of global warming. It's about 30 times higher potential than CO2. But what's not talked about in the storyline and is left out is nitrous oxide, which has a 300 times CO2 potential. In other words, it's 100 times more potent than methane. And nitrous oxide comes from synthetic fertilizers primarily. About 3/4 of the nitrous oxide produced for agriculture comes from the generation of synthetic fertilizers. Well, if we switch from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture, we're going to increase drastically the amount of synthetic fertilizer that we need. We will drastically increase the amount of nitrous oxide produced, which will have a more significant impact on the warming of the atmosphere than methane production will. Part of the storyline that says that animal agriculture produces all these greenhouse gases is because they say if I was to raise, let's say, barley or legumes or something, I could either feed them to humans or cattle, and it'd be that same amount of greenhouse gases emitted to raise that grain. And I feed it to cattle, then I have to process it farther because I have to raise the cow for a period of time, and that's why there's so many more greenhouse gases generated in the animal agriculture model that's looked at when you're creating this storyline. The problem is that is not actually correct. About 90% of the feed that is fed to livestock, either in dairy or cattle or chickens or pigs, is actually an agricultural byproduct. When we make soybeans or we grow soybeans, when we process some, we end up with a bunch of leftover stuff. That stuff is then fed to animals, and that would normally be thrown away and would be considered a waste. As it is, when we have animal agriculture, we actually can feed that to the cows, or we can feed it to pigs and actually convert that waste into usable product. The same thing is true for a bunch of different grains. Cotton seeds, another one. Molasses is another one. We end up with all these byproducts of growing plants that can be fed to cattle. In addition to this, there's another aspect that's not considered in the normal calculation looking at the impact of animal agriculture, and that is how much tilling or processing the soil needs to grow. If I'm growing hay for cows, I typically just like cutting the grass in my lawn. I just cut the grass and I feed it to the cows. I dry it and I feed it to them through the winter. Now, if I am growing plants to eat, I would typically till that soil, especially if I'm growing vegetables. I would till that soil and till that soil. And the more I till the soil, the more carbon dioxide gets released from the soil, in addition to methane and nitrous oxide. All that gets released into the atmosphere. This is not considered in the calculations. This is a very important point because a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases is actually stored in soil in a significant amount. About a third of all methane, 2/3 of nitrous oxide, and about a fifth of all CO2 is actually stored in the soil. When we till it, a lot of that is actually released to the atmosphere, and that is not included in the calculations when comparing plant-based to animal-based. Another part that is not considered in the calculations is the fact that if I'm growing grasses and I'm raising cows on grasslands or pigs or chickens, then I'm actually increasing the health and biodiversity of the soil that grass is living on. Those roots are going deeper into the ground. I'm storing or sequestering more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it into the ground. And if I don't till that soil, then that carbon dioxide, those greenhouse gases get stored into the carbon gets stored into the soil. This is not considered part of the calculation, and it does not happen when I'm doing plant-based food. That's typically a lot of tillage and turning the soil and basically releasing all the greenhouse gases from the soil. And I only grow annuals, and annuals have a very shallow root system, so it doesn't absorb as much water. Like the longer and deeper my roots are, the more water I can absorb per acre. So when I take all this into consideration, I can actually produce more pounds of food per acre growing cows and chickens and turkeys and all that than I can on a plant-based system. I can produce more calories per acre, I can produce more pounds per acre, I can produce more protein per acre, and I can revitalize the soil by using agriculture systems that don't deplete the soil like plant-based systems do. So this storyline that's out there that we need to stop eating meat and reduce our meat consumption in order to save the environment and reduce our overall global temperatures is simply based on false assumptions and has an element of truth to it to make it sound like maybe it's correct. But when you dive into it, it's actually not. It's based on false information. So the idea that we could just eat what the cow eats and that we could get rid of the middleman, which is an argument you hear quite a bit from people that are against animal agriculture, is simply false. 85 to 90% of what the cow eats is actually agricultural byproducts and would never be consumed by humans and would really be just extra waste and would be thrown away. Next is the storyline that says that instead of raising cattle on land, we could use that land to grow plants, and that would be a more efficient use of the agricultural land, and that would be better for us. The reality is that animals can be raised on land that's completely unsuitable for growing crops and in places where you couldn't grow crops for very much of the year. Next is the idea that the generation of manure or animal waste is bad for the environment, when in reality, it's what gives us our fertilizer to grow plants and other things. And if we switch to completely synthetic fertilizers, that's actually worse for the environment and generates more greenhouse gases than if we go manure. Obviously, we have to do manure management effectively, which can be done. It's just a matter of doing it. Synthetic fertilizer produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. The nitrogen part of synthetic fertilizers is actually made from mixing the nitrogen from air with natural gas. So we're using fossil fuels to make synthetic fertilizers. We also mine phosphate rock and potash in order to make the other parts of synthetic fertilizer. So we have a lot of mining involved. So there's basically a lot of additional effort required to make synthetic fertilizers, where when we have animal agriculture, we can generate manure and fertilizer from the process of growing animals. Having animals on the soil and being part of the ecosystem is the way that the world works and has worked for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. And to try to replace that system with a synthetic system is really playing with fire and could potentially destroy the earth in ways that we don't even understand yet. Raising plants to feed to animals requires less tilling than growing vegetables and food for humans. Now, the tilling of the soil increases the release of greenhouse gases and reduces the root depth. And so we cannot sequester as much carbon when we plow the earth under all the time, every year, multiple times a year. We simply cannot restore the carbon and nutrients to the soil like we can when we do animal-based agriculture. We can actually sequester significantly more carbon into the earth using an animal-based system than we can with a plant-based system. Converting to a plant-based diet requires a significant amount of supplementation and monitoring to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients we need. Now, this is most detrimental to young people and to people who don't have the resources to pay for all that supplementation. And overall, it would be a negative impact to the human population on the earth if we tried to go plant-based and then replace the natural way that our bodies receive nutrition with synthetic forms and supplementation. Now, the last one we'll talk about is sort of a David and Goliath story, where we have animal agriculture on one side, and then we have plant-based. But plant-based is really processed food-based. Processed food is primarily plant-based food, and the plant-based food industry has a huge lobby behind it. Processed food has an advertising budget in the billions, tens of billions of dollars. And if you look at all of animal agriculture, it has an advertising budget of less than $1 billion. So you're really fighting this huge conglomerate that is very interested in squashing any dissenting views. So in order for David to beat Goliath, he's going to need the truth as his stones. And that's what's going to defeat this idea or these false premises that this whole idea that plant-based agriculture is what's going to save us from destruction of the planet. Now, obviously, there's a lot more information that needs to be thrown out there. I've included some references in the notes, and hopefully you go and dig this up and start looking at this thing and questioning the narrative that's being thrown out there, this storyline that's being thrown out there, and people just buy it. The problem is as long as we keep saying something over and over again, people just start to believe it, whether it's true or not. And we see this in all areas of life. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Take some time and start looking at it and dig into it yourself and see what you think. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Check out my channel for a deeper dive into the topics of energy and climate change.